valid contract is nothing but where both the parties fulfills all the essential elements of a contract. That is called valid contract. Consideration should not be illegal or it should not be immoral, and it should not cause any problem to the public policy, whether the stranger promises or not, but the consideration can be fulfilled or supplied by the stranger party. Hello everyone, I am Arun Kumar, lecturer in Department of Commerce and Management, Vidhyaashram First Grade College, the Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. Dear students, welcome to this new session, session 3 on unit number 1, that is Indian Contract Act 1872. So in the earlier session, we had discussed about so many concepts about what is contract, what is agreement, what is offer and acceptance, what are the types of contracts we have, and what are the elements, the essential elements of contract. About this and all we discussed in the previous sessions. So in this session, we'll be discussing about, yes, what is consideration. Okay, we'll be discussing about what is consideration. So without consideration, we can't do any transactions. Without consideration, we can't do any transactions. So if there are two parties, if they are selling the products or if they are coming into an agreement, yes, there should be a consideration between the parties to get into the contract. So what is this consideration? So consideration is one of the essential elements of a valid contract. Yes, as I said, consideration is the essential element of a valid contract. So then what is valid contract? Valid contract is nothing but where both the parties fulfills all the essential elements of a contract. That is called valid contract. So consideration is one of the essential element of a valid contract. The term consideration means something in return. Yes, something in return, that is quid pro quo. Consideration must result in a benefit. Consideration must result in a benefit to the promisor and a determinant or loss to the promisee. Yes, consideration should benefit the promisor. That means the person who is receiving, that should be beneficial for that particular promisor, and it's a loss to the promisee. That means the person who promises, for example, there are two parties, Mr. A, okay, Mr. A and Mr. B. We have two parties, Mr. A and Mr. B. What Mr. A will do? Mr. A promises, okay, Mr. A promise to Mr. B that he will give 100 rupees. He will give 100 rupees to Mr. B. Okay, Mr. A promised to Mr. B that he will give 100 rupees to Mr. B. So here Mr. A is what? Mr. A is promisee. That means the person who is promising is called promisee. Okay, Mr. B is what? Promiser. That means the person who receiving the benefits is called promiser. So Mr. A promised to Mr. B by stating that he will give 100 rupees to Mr. B. So here Mr. A is a promisee, Mr. B is a promiser. Okay. So 100 rupees is given by Mr. A. Okay. So this 100 rupees is a loss. 100 rupees is a loss for the promisee. That means whoever is giving, Mr. A is giving, right? So it's a loss for Mr. A, and this 100 rupees is profit to Mr. B. This is what the statement says. What it says? Consideration means something return, that is, consideration must result in a benefit to the promisor. Must result in benefit to the promisor. Here what promisor is receiving? Promisor is receiving 100 rupees, right? That 100 rupees is benefited to him. So the consideration should be benefited to the promisor, and loss to the promisee. That means it's a loss to Mr. A because Mr. A is giving 100 rupees from his pocket. So it's a loss. Loss to the promisee or a determinant to both. Without consideration, a contract is void or nude. That is nudum pactum. Okay, in other language they'll say nudum pactum. If we are doing transaction, if we are getting into a transaction or if we are getting into a contract without consideration, that contract will be considered as void contract. And those kind of contracts will not be having a validity. That contracts will not be having any validity. So consideration is nothing but that must result in benefiting the promisor, and it's a determinant or loss to the promisee. That is called consideration, and without consideration all the contracts are void. This is the meaning of consideration. So let us move on. Section 2 subsection D of the Indian Contract Act. It explains under section 2 subsection D of the Indian Contract Act 1872 defines consideration as follows. It defines the consideration. Yes, we have a particular definition under Indian Contract Act 1872 under section 2 subsection D. So how it defines? What it defines about the consideration? So when at the desire of the promisor, the promisee or any other person has done or abstained from doing or does or abstains from doing or promises to do or abstain from doing something, such act or abstinence or promises is called a consideration from the promisee. Yes. So here the promisee will be promising and he will be promising to give something to the promisor where the promisor will be get benefited, by the promise made by the promisee, and the consideration whichever he agreed to give, whatever the consideration he agreed to give the promisee, that consideration should be benefited to the promisor. That is the meaning of consideration. The essential elements of a valid consideration. If you want to call it as a valid consideration, then yes, the consideration should have to satisfy few conditions. So those conditions are: it must move at the desire of the promisor. Yes, it must move at the desire of the promisor. So what is the desire of promisor? As a promisor, that means as a receiver of consideration, I should be happy with that. For example, I will be selling my property, for example, 10,000. I will be selling the property at 10,000. If I receive full 10,000 rupees, I will be very happy. If I receive only 8,000, I will not be happy. So the receiver, the promisor should be happy. Then only that will be called as a valid consideration. So that is what point A says. It must move at the desire of the promisor. Next, it may move from the promisee or any other person. Yes, it may move from the promisee or from any other person. See, I will agree. As a person, I will agree to pay some amount. Let us say I am Mr. A. I agreed to pay 10,000 rupees to Mr. B. Okay, Mr. A agrees to pay 10,000 rupees to Mr. B. But what happens in some situation? Mr. A is not having money. Okay, Mr. A is not having money. So what he did? Mr. A asked Mr. C. To pay 10,000 rupees to Mr. B. Okay, so now who is paying 10,000 rupees? Mr. C. Who is supposed to pay? Mr. A is supposed to pay, but on behalf of Mr. A, Mr. C is paying the amount. So the amount, the consideration must move from the promisee or from any other person. It may be passed present or future. Yes, the consideration may be past, present or future. Okay, it may be promised, the consideration may be promised at the past, or the consideration paid in the future, or the consideration paid at the present. But it may be past, present or future, but the consideration should be there. It must be some value. Yes, it must be of some value. Just you can't say that, okay, I'll be giving this property to you. The property should be valued at cost. Okay, the property should be valued at cost. Like say you should sell it for 10,000 or 20,000. So the property should be valued. Okay. It must be real and not illusory. Yes. The consideration must be real. The consideration must be valued. Okay. The consideration must be valued. Then only that consideration will be considered as valid consideration. Next, must be something other than the promiser's existing obligation. Yes. It must be something other than the promiser's existing obligation. Whatever the promise he had made already, the consideration must be other than that. Next, it must not be illegal, immoral or opposed to public policy. Yes, the consideration should not be illegal or it should not be immoral and it should not cause any problem to the public policy. So if a consideration fulfills all these conditions, all this many conditions, 7 conditions, then those considerations will be considered as valid consideration with respect to the Indian Contract Act of 1872. Next, a contract without consideration is void. That means, yes, a contract without consideration, will be considered as void. That means that contract is not valid. There should be a consideration if you want to consider that particular contract as valid. The general rules is an agreement made without consideration is void. Yes, the general rule says that any agreement without consideration is void. That means that is not valid. Section 25 and section 185 deals with the exception to this rule. These cases are, yes, in general what the law says, any agreement without consideration is void, but under section 25 and section 185 deals with exceptions. So in few cases it is exceptional, even though without consideration also we can do the transactions, we can get into agreement, we can create a contract. Even though without the consideration we can create a valid contract or we can create a agreement between the parties. So which are those exceptional cases? Love and affection. Yes, with love and affections, if your parents are giving you, if their parents are transferring their property to your name, that can be considered as a valid contract, that can be considered as a valid agreement. Because of love and affection, your parents are giving you. Okay, they are not taking any money from you, just they are transferring their property to your name because of their son or their daughter. So at that case, it is exceptional that need not to transfer it on the basis of consideration. The second thing, compensation for voluntary services. Yes, if any compensatory is received for the voluntary service, for example, if government is giving you any compensatory, okay, if they are giving you a site or if they are giving you a house, they will not expect anything. Because of your service, because of your voluntary service, they will be giving you the compensatory. So at that time also, you need not receive it based on the consideration, you can receive it as a compensatory. So any compensatory from the voluntary services, for voluntary services, that will also be considered as a valid contract. Next, promise to pay a time barred debt. Yes, promise to pay a time barred debt. Sometimes you had given some loan, okay, even you had given some loan to a person, but he failed to pay back it. Okay, you have taken loan, you had given credit to a person, but he failed to pay back it. But after a few years, he paid it. Okay, at that time also, you can call it as a valid consideration. Next, completed gifts. Okay, completed gifts. So whatever the gifts we receive, sometimes from the parents only, or from husband, or husband from wife, or wife from husband, or from children's, or from parents, from relatives, we receive gifts. No, at the time also we can create the agreement without consideration. Next, agencies. Yes, sometimes while we are transferring between the agencies, at the time also consideration is not required. Contribution to charity. Yes, if you are contributing to the charity, at that time also you need not to create a contract with consideration. Sometimes you are giving a property. You are giving a property like 1 acre of land to a orphanage. So if you are giving 1 acre of land to orphanage, there they need not to pay you the amount. Because of charity you are giving. So there is no consideration in that. At that time also it is valid. So in these exceptional cases, consideration is not required. In other cases, consideration is must and should. Moving further, stranger to a contract. Okay, stranger to a contract. If a stranger enters into a contract, what we are supposed to do, how it works. So though a stranger to consideration can use, because the consideration can be furnished or supplied by any person, whether he promises or not, but a stranger to a contract cannot sue because of the absence of privity of contract. That means relationship subsisting between the parties to a contract. Yes, here a stranger to a contract, at that time also what will happen? A stranger to consideration can use a stranger for consideration. That means for consideration purpose we can use the stranger, because the consideration can be furnished or supplied by any person. Yes, a stranger into a contract. As I said in the previous slide, I was explaining and given the example. Mr. A is supposed to give 10,000 to Mr. B, but Mr. A at present don't have money. On behalf of Mr. A, Mr. C will pay the amount. Here Mr. C is a stranger to the contract, but still he can pay. So consideration can be paid, consideration can be fulfilled by any person, because any party can pay the consideration. Is the promises or not, whether he promises or not, whether the stranger promises or not, but the consideration can be fulfilled or supplied by the stranger party. But a stranger to a contract cannot sue because of the absence of privity of contract. Yes, here the consideration can be fulfilled or supplied by the stranger, but the stranger can't sue against the contract. That means the particular stranger can't raise a complaint against the contract because he is not the person who is into the contract. So here stranger can be a can supply the or fulfill the consideration, but he can't sue against the contract, and he will not be having any rights against the contract. Free consent. So what is this free consent? So meaning of free consent. Two or more persons or two or more people are said to consent when they agree upon the same thing in the same sense at the same time. So here what happens? If 2 or 3 people comes together and if they agrees on the same thing, if they agrees on the same statement for the same situation at the same time and at the same sense, is called free consent. That means giving our approval to a particular thing. So if there are 3 people or 4 people or 5 people, all the 5 people come together, all the 5 persons come together and they discuss each other and they sense each other, and at the same time they give the consent. Okay, they give their consent. That is called free consent. So meaning of free consent under section 14. So section 14 describes the cases when the consent is not free. It lays down that consent is not free if it is caused by coercion, undue influence, fraud, misinterpretation, etc. If the consent is not free, the agreement is avoidable at the option of the party whose consent was not free. Yes, free consent, that means all coming together and giving their consent, giving their approval. In some cases, we cannot call it as a free consent when The consent is because of coercion or undue influence or because of fraud or misinterpretation. Sometimes by showing misinterpretation statements or making him fool, what they'll do, they take the free consent. If that scenario arises, in those scenarios, we cannot consider it as a free consent. Free consent is nothing but from his heart he should say yes. That is called free consent. Because of someone is forcing, if he say yes, that will not be considered as a free consent. Coercion. So what is this coercion? So coercion simply means forcing a person to enter into a contract. Simple. Coercion is nothing but forcing a person to enter into a contract. So section 15 defines coercion as committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by the Indian Penal Code or unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property to the prejudice of any person, whatever with the intention of causing any person to enter into an agreement. Yes, what we will do in coercion? Forcefully we ask someone to get into our contract. Even though if he is not interested, by influencing him negatively, by threatening him, we are going to make him to get into a contract. We are going to make him to get into an agreement. Even though it is against the law, what we will do, just we force him, we threaten him. Okay, by unlawful means we threaten him and we ask him to get into the contract. That is called coercion. So if any particular agreement has happened, if any contract is happening just because of coercion, then it is not a valid contract, and those kind of contracts or agreements will not be considered as a valid contract. The essential elements of coercions are committing or threatening to commit any act forbidden by Indian Penal Code. Yes, committing or threatening to commit any forbidden. For example, it is not according to the law. Okay, that is not described in law, but we are forcing some other persons, to do that against the law. Okay. Next, unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property. Yes, unlawful detaining or threatening to detain any property. If you are threatening to detain any property or unlawful detaining of property, that is also the essential element of coercion. Next, the act of coercion may be directed at any person and not necessarily at the other party to the agreement. Next, the act of coercion must be done with the object of inducing or compelling any person to enter into an agreement. Next, undue influence. What is this undue influence? It is kind of moral coercion. That means just by knowing their weakness, we are going to force them. Morally, we are going to force them. That is called moral coercion. Section 16, subsection 1 defines undue influence as a contract is said to be induced by undue influence where the relations subsisting between the parties are such that one of the parties is in position to dominate and will of other and uses that position to obtain an unfair advantage over the other. So in a particular contract, two parties will be there. Okay, in two parties, one party will be having the rights, and that one party will what do? That parties are such that one party is in the position of dominating. For example, younger brother and elder brother. Okay, younger brother will be having all the rights in father property, in ancestor property. Younger brother, for example, in father property, younger brother will be having more rights than the elder brother. So just because of that advantage, he is going to dominate. Just because younger brother have more rights on the father's property, he is going to dominate the elder brother. That is called moral coercion, because of the dominating power you have in that particular contract. What you will do, you just dominate the other party. That is called moral coercion and undue influence. With this, I'm going to wind up this session. In the upcoming session, I'll come up with few more new topics. Until then, thank you all. Have a nice day. Namaste.